Hey guys, in this video I will attempt to paint a fully non-metallic metal Iron Warrior Dreadnought in less time than I would spend on a normal size model, so about 8 hours overall. Can I do it? Let's find out. So a couple of weeks ago I got the new Horus Heresy box, and obviously the first thing I had to build was the huge Saturn Dreadnought. The Terminators are fantastic, but this guy is clearly the star of the show. But when he was finally assembled, I still had to come up with how I would actually paint him up. Fortunately, while I was putting him together, the cover of the instruction manual made me realize that I still had a debt to Perturabos Legion. You see, I started an Iron Warriors Dreadnought project years ago, but for some reason I never finished it. So now was the perfect time to make up for that lapse in discipline. But there was just a teeny tiny issue. That original Dread I started in true metallic colors, but these days I paint mostly everything in non-metallic metal because it just looks so much better and it's much more fun to paint, so I kinda had to go with that here as well. And I can usually paint normal size models in non-metallic metal in under 10 hours or so, but this guy was 10 times the size of a Space Marine, and considering that Iron Warriors are pretty much painted in all metal, steel on the armor panels and gold on the trim, this will be quite the challenge. Then again, challenges are fun, so I pondered this one for a while and I came up with a plan using all the little shortcuts and tricks I know to get an actual non-metallic look, but without spending 100 hours on the model. And if you want to see how I managed to do it in about 8 hours painting time, then let's get started. And by the way, here on YouTube I will go through the whole process touching on all the major points, but I can't fit every little detail in a 15-minute video. So if you want all the details of the painting process, I will upload a PDF painting guide and a several hours long time-lapse video on my Patreon, so check those out. The link will be in the video description. Alright, so I have the model assembled and primed in black, and I actually opted to magnetize it so I can handle every piece separately. I can't emphasize enough how big this boy is. A single weapon arm is bigger than a Terminator, so painting it in one piece would make things very difficult. Now the most important thing about the Iron Warriors color scheme is obviously the metallic armor, so that's what we will start with. If we get this right, the rest will be a walk in the park, and if we mess it up, well, let's not do that. And if I asked you what color Iron Warriors armor plates are, you would probably say grey, right? And you wouldn't be wrong, but also there is a lot more to it. Basically, if you try to paint non-metallic metal steel with only neutral grey colors, the end result will look pretty boring and probably nothing like metal. Instead, we need to get some subtle colors in there right from the start, and then we can steer into greys in the highlights. To make things easier, I decided to divide the armor panels into two categories. The ones facing down towards the ground and the ones facing away from the ground and mostly towards the light. The ones facing down got partially covered in desaturated green colors, while the ones facing up got some reddish-brown highlights instead. The idea here is that the ground is reflecting on the underside of the Dreadnought and the rest of the panels will have a rusty corroded undertone to make them more interesting. And if you're wondering where to put these highlights, then I can tell you that it's much less scientific than you might think. I simply imagine where the light would hit the panels if it was coming from above and slightly from the left of the model. But in general, you can't really go wrong if you simply highlight the top half of the panels and leave the bottom part darker. And once I establish these colors on the panels, it's time to highlight them further. I simply spray lighter and lighter colors inside the previous highlights. In the shadow areas I go with brighter and brighter greenish grays, and in the light areas with slightly more reddish grays. I'm simply operating inside the highlights I established earlier, and with every new color I decrease the area I cover, leaving some of the previous color around. And then there are two more important things to consider. We need to make sure that the panels facing up will end up lighter than the ones facing down, so on those I go 2 more steps up in brightness compared to the shadows. And the areas around the face and the weapon arms should be brighter than anywhere else. These are the places people look at the most on the model, so we need to emphasize them more with highlights. And making these brighter and leaving other areas darker also creates contrast, which we can never have enough of. When I'm finally done with the light grey highlights, you can barely see the original green and reddish brown tones underneath. Usually at this point you will also feel that things got a little too desaturated, because we used the airbrush and a lot of desaturated colors, so then it's time to re-establish some of the color we lost. In this case I took some burnt umber ink and sprayed it in the shadow areas very carefully and thinly. I don't want to overpower what I did before, I just want to sneak in some extra color and use the transparency of the ink to still keep all the existing highlights under the new color. I will add some more tones later in the process, but for now I felt that I was done with the airbrushing part of the armor and it was time to move on to other things. But before I could do that, there was a little issue I had to solve first. Using the airbrush means that I painted over all the recessed areas and little crevices of the armor, making everything uniformly bright inside the highlights. The model overall is nice and contrasty as a whole, but inside the individual highlight areas I destroyed all the contrast with the airbrush. So now I had to fix it, so it was time to pull out one of those shortcuts from from my bag of tricks. To start with, I coated the whole model in a couple of layers of gloss varnish, and then I diluted black oil paint to a consistency that is barely thicker than water. The oil paint over the gloss varnish will flow into the deeper areas almost automatically. And I could have washed this all over the armor to get it into the crevices, but then I would have had to remove it from the panels after and it would still darken and smudge them slightly. So instead I applied it in a targeted way with the tip of the brush, avoiding staining the armor panels with it. This takes a little more brush control and time, but in the end it's still faster by avoiding the extra removal step. I made sure to get this into all the recessed areas around the rivets and basically everywhere where two elements meet, creating a dark outline around them. And as you can see, the difference between the original and the pin-washed model is pretty dramatic. Even without brush highlights, the model immediately has a lot more contrast. Okay, so the armor is in a pretty good spot now, so while the oil paint's dry, I can do the other iconic part of the Iron Warriors color scheme, the Hazzard stripes on the shoulder pad. And this is actually quite easy compared to the armor. I started by applying stripes of masking tape parallel with each other at the same angle and roughly at the same distance from each other. The masking tape represents the black stripes and the area in between them will be the yellow stripes. And it's very important to push down on the sides of the masking tape so paint won't flow under it while airbrushing. I've learned that the hard way years ago. When everything is neatly masked, I use the same reddish brown color I also used on the armor to block in the area of the yellow stripes. I will cover this color pretty much fully, but it's much easier to cover the black with this and then paint the yellow over it than trying to cover directly over the black. Now I spray the whole thing again with a nice saturated yellow color with a lot of thin layers, patiently waiting for the previous one to dry before applying the next one to avoid the paint running on the smooth surface, until I get everything nice and opaque. At this point we just need a little trick to make it look good. I load some orange ink into the airbrush and gently spray the ends of the stripes with this, applying more layers at the very end to create the transition. And when I remove the masking tape, which is super satisfying by the way, the end result looks like this. Pretty neat, right? Now I just have to add some subtle highlights on the black shoulder pad so it doesn't look too plain. I do this by spraying some dark gray layers over the black, building it up towards the top corner but keeping the majority of the surface still black. And of course I need to apply a couple of transfers as well to really mark him as an Iron Warrior. Just like with the color scheme, I use the cover art of the instruction manual to select which emblems to go for and where. At this stage I spray the whole model with a couple of thin layers of matte varnish to knock back the shine of the previous varnish and the oil paints, plus to integrate the transfers. Okay, that's two of the three colors from the color scheme halfway done, but I still had to do something about the gold trim before moving on to putting on the finishing touches with the brush. And I was considering doing these entirely by brush, but that would result in a very different finish compared to the armor panels, so in the end I went with airbrushing the gold on as well. Which meant that I needed to protect the panels I had just painstakingly painted from any overspray since the trim is right next to them. On the lower body I covered everything with masking putty, carefully arranging it in a way that covers everything that could get some overspray. Just like with the masking tape, it's very important to get the edges of this right up to the trim with no gaps to avoid any nasty surprises that might require a lot of time to clean up. Theoretically, I could have used this on the shoulder pads as well, but instead I went with a liquid mask there since it was easier to get in place perfectly. With everything masked, the painting process is pretty simple. I started with some very saturated brown and then ochre colors first to establish the highlights. And it is very important to start very saturated because later inevitably we will lose saturation and we need enough to begin with so we can afford to lose some. Then I went up in brightness even further using an actual yellow color containing white. This is as high as I'm willing to push it with the airbrush at this point, the rest will be done with the brush. And despite my best efforts, I still lost too much saturation, so I added some color back with some sepia ink and I called it done for now. So I removed all the masking stuff and I rejoiced that I avoided the overspray almost completely and the trim looked like this. But I actually made a mistake. I wonder if you guys can see it, but I completely missed it at the time and I wouldn't notice it until I started doing the highlights. Well, we will have to come back to it later and lose some time fixing it, but let's move on for now. With the airbrushing phase done, the model actually looks quite good already, but it still lacks contrast and definition, so it's time to get the brushes out and add the finishing touches. Well, I say that, but the whole airbrushing phase took me almost exactly 4 hours to complete up until this point, so the brush highlights will take another 4 hours. The brush is obviously slower, but it can do things that are simply impossible with the airbrush. But the game plan with the brush is pretty simple. I already have all the large highlights established with the airbrush, but what we don't have are edge highlights, and those are super important for non-metallic metal. So now I will focus on them almost exclusively with the brush, plus I will add some little scratches and marks on the large smooth surfaces of the armor to break them up a little, make them more interesting and to mask the airbrush look. I'm using the same colors that I also used in the airbrushing phase, but since I'm using them with a brush, they show up more strongly so they can act as highlights even over the same tone. I start with darker colors and only highlight the edges in the shadows with them. I don't bother applying them in the light areas since they would darken the edges there instead of making them brighter, which is the opposite of what we want. As I start using the lighter colors, I will shift my attention to the midtones and away from the shadows. It's important to keep the shadow areas darker, so I don't use the brighter colors there. And finally, with the brightest highlight colors, I still paint some of the edges in the midtones, mostly the ones facing directly up towards the light, but I mostly focus on the edges in the brightest highlight areas. By the way, if you're struggling with doing edge highlights like these, I have a video dedicated to this topic on the channel that you might find useful, so check that out. Oh, and one important point I wanted to emphasize again, I concentrated the most and brightest highlights around the model's head and on the top of the gun arms, because that is where I wanted the viewer's attention the most. Alright, that is the steel panels done, so let's do the gold ones in a similar fashion as well. There are a lot less of those, so they are much easier to do. Similarly to the steel, I added more and bigger highlights on the upper body, leaving the lower one darker, and I was using the same colors again as during the airbrushing phase. But then I realized the mistake I was talking about earlier. As I just told you, I wanted the biggest and brightest highlights around the model's head, but because I didn't have the pads attached to the body when I made the highlights, I actually placed the shadow areas in that spot. I could leave it like this, of course, and it would still look reasonably good, but now that I have noticed it, that would bother me every time I look at this model, so there was no way around it, I had to fix it. So I applied some masking putty around the area, I took out my airbrush again, and I extended the highlight from the top to reach around the edge that is next to the head as well. There, that looks much better. Now I could finish up the highlights with even brighter edge highlights in those areas. And here's how it looks with the trim corrected and edge highlighted. But since I already had the airbrush out, I could also use the opportunity to correct one more mistake. Sometimes during the process, especially when you're painting in sub-assemblies, one can't judge the overall contrast of the model. And now that I saw it assembled, I felt that despite my best efforts, I over-highlighted the shadows, and as a result, there was not enough contrast between the shadow and the light areas. Fortunately for us, it's really easy to fix this by adding some filters with the airbrush, and we can also use the opportunity to sneak in some more colors. So I mixed some brownish and red inks first, and I sprayed them mostly inside of the legs, in some of the areas that should be in shadow more because they are covered by the upper body, and some of the panels facing down in general. Then I mixed some black and purple inks and went even further, only spraying this in the deepest shadows. The difference might look subtle, but it is there. Okay, now we are almost done. There is only the plasma glow I needed to do and the little OSL effect it produces on the armor panels around it. A little earlier I painted the plasma coils on the arms with some very saturated red inks. Then I dropped multiple layers of white ink into the crevices of the coils, and I used the airbrush to spray the inside of the barrels, leaving a little red around the inner white core. Now I mixed red and orange fluorescent inks, and I shot this mix on the coils, not bothering if I hit the area of the gun around them as well, since that will just add to the effect. I sprayed a lot of thin consecutive layers until I got the opacity I wanted over the white. Finally, I mounted the guns on the body to see how they align with the armor panels adjacent to them. Then I sprayed a hint of red glow on the parts of the body I thought would be hit by the reddish light. And with that, after 8 hours of paint time, my Iron Warriors Dreadnought was done in its full non-metallic glory. I obviously had to cut some corners, and the metal is somewhat stylized and not as detailed as I could have made it with the brush, but considering how long this took me to make, I think it looks pretty darn good. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. I hope you enjoyed watching this little experiment, and if you got inspired, don't forget that you can find the detailed painting process on Patreon. Also, if you liked the video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up and maybe drop a comment under it as well. It really helps with the algorithm showing it to other people. And as usual, before I sign off, I want to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible. Without them, I wouldn't be able to dedicate the time necessary to keep the channel going, and that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.